You're watching The Ready Writer, a show where I get to speak to writers of all different genres, mediums, and experiences. The Ready Writer. Are you ready? It is time for another episode of The Ready Writer. Thank you for joining me for another episode. I am your host, Casey Bell, and Michael Taylor joins me today. Let's get the show started. Did you aspire to be a author as a child, or was this something that was unplanned?
Definitely unplanned. I never dreamed of being a writer. I actually became a writer after learning or journaling for several years. I'd gone through a divorce and some things, and I was just trying to kind of put my life back together. So I started journaling, and I found that I really enjoyed writing. And from there, I kind of moved over from writing in my journal to writing books.
Was there ever a hesitation to publish your books, or what was the thing that said, I'm going to do this?
Well, my first book I wrote back in 1995, and I wrote the book because of a conversation I heard in a restaurant between these two young black males. And they were having a conversation about the eradication of black men from society. And it was one of the most depressing conversations I'd ever heard. And so I listened to their conversation for a while, and I got up, walked over to their table. I apologized for eavesdropping, but I said, man, please tell me you don't believe what you just said. And one of the guys looked at me. And now you got to remember, these guys were obviously well-educated, well-spoken, well-dressed, professional black men, right? And one of the guys looked at me and he says, absolutely, I believe everything I said. He says, don't you watch the news? He said, I believe in 20 years, all black men will either be dead or in jail. And it wasn't just what he said, but how he said it that really just broke my heart. And I knew there was nothing I could have said that would have changed his mind. So I simply put my hand on his shoulder and I said, don't believe the hype, my brother, don't believe the hype. And I walked away. And as I was walking away, there was a part of me that said, man, you've got to do something. You've got to do something to change the mindset of black men. I had no idea what to do because at the time my life was in total chaos. But that conversation really stuck with me. And a couple of years later, again, I had kind of put my life back together, and I remembered that conversation. I said, I'm going to write a book. I'm going to write a book to empower black men. And I wrote a book called Brothers, Are You Listening? A Success Guide for the 90s. And that's how I began my author journey.
Amazing. So what was your, well, obviously this is in the 90s, so the journey was much more different than it is today. How did you begin to publish? How did you know what to do?
Well, first of all, when I wrote Brothers, Are You Listening? Back in the 90s, see, internet wasn't as popular as it is now. And so what you had to do is you had to send a query letter to publishers to see if they were interested in your book. And so I sent off 60 letters to 60 different publishers. I was rejected by 59 of those publishers. The very last publisher was actually interested in my book. And so I get a return letter. She says, look, I'm interested. Give me a call. So I call this lady up and she says, man, I really loved your book. She says, but my research shows that black men don't buy books. And she asked me if I was willing to change the title and maybe change some of the content. I said, ma'am, that would be like asking a father to change his child's name. I said, I can't do that. And she said, I fully understand. She says, I love your message. Good luck. And so I just decided, heck, I'm going to figure out how to do this myself. So I got a part-time job at a bookstore. I learned about the publishing industry, read a ton of books on self-publishing, launched my own book, and the rest is history.
So how did you do that? Because today self-publishing is, I guess you can say, easier. There's more resources today than there was then. How did you do that?
Well, again, it's all a matter of commitment. I was really and here's a really funny story. I was in a bookstore once before I got the job working in the bookstore. I was in this bookstore and there was a book titled, and this is the actual title, The Gas We Pass. And it was about farting, right? The book was published by one of the publishers that had rejected my book. And it ticked me off. I got really, I said, are you serious? You will publish a book called The Gas We Pass and you won't publish Brothers, Are You Listening? And I was so pissed. I said, look, I'm going to prove them wrong. And so that was the catalyst for me starting that journey. And after that, that's when I got the job in the bookstore. And again, I just did a ton of research, read a lot of books, and figured it all out. And like I said, started my own publishing company.
So did you have to buy all of the machines and things like that print the book?
Oh, no. Back then, again, the amazing thing about technology today is publishing a book is pretty simple. Not easy, but pretty simple. But see, back then, you had to, once you put your manuscript together and have it ready to print, then you'd go to a printer and then you'd have the books printed. Now, in order to get the best price, you'd have to print a lot of books. Otherwise, the books were pretty expensive. And so back then, if a minimum of about 500 books would give you a pretty decent price to make a little profit, if you sold it. And so I actually found a guy that was a printer who was a friend of a friend kind of thing. And he loved my book idea. And I told him I didn't have the money. He says, here's what I'll do. He says, you think you can sell them? I said, absolutely. So he said, look, I will pay for printing the books for you. You just have to pay me back. And, we set a date and all of that. And so basically I got my books printed. We printed 500 copies and I became a selling machine. I mean, I was going to beauty salons, doing book signings. I did some local radio interviews here in Houston. And I just was obsessed with selling it, right? And actually promoting it. And interestingly enough, the average book, and there's literally millions of books published a year, the overwhelming majority of books will never sell 500 copies in its lifetime. I mean, it's like 90% of the books published will never sell 500 copies. I sold my first year 1,000 copies of my book with no internet, no marketing, just me going around promoting my book. So if you're really committed to something, it's amazing what you can accomplish if you're passionate about it.
I think it's pretty sad. America has always been, in my opinion, not the best country in the world. And it's because if you put two books in front of them, one on farting and one on changing their mindset, most Americans are going to choose the farting book, which is why book publishers do that, because their goal is to make money, not necessarily give literature, but make money. And so they published that book because they knew people would choose farting over changing their mentality, and not just on Black men, but on money, changing their mentality on relationships. Americans care more about entertaining themselves than changing themselves. And so I'm not shocked by that, but it is sad that that's where we're still at from 90 till 2021.
Yeah, and as a life coach, see, my job is to help people recognize that if you want something badly enough, no one can keep you from attaining it except yourself. So it is, without question, a mindset thing. It's a mindset game. And we live in a culture and society that thrives on negativity and pessimism and cynicism and sensationalism and all those negative things. But at the same time, as human beings, we have access to something which I call divine intelligence. And it is that intelligence that when we connect to it, it will guide us and support us in fulfilling any dream that we may have. And so it's really a matter of shifting our focus from what's going on out there to what's going on in here and in here. And so my latest book, which is called The Good News Is The Future is Brighter Than You Think, is really about changing mindsets. It's about helping people recognize that despite what you see in the media, it is my belief that there's never been a better time to be alive on the planet than right now. Now, I'm absolutely aware of all the challenges that face America and the world got coronavirus, we got racial unrest, all that. I get all that. I'm real clear on that. But at the same time, if you look at the trajectory that human beings have been on for the last couple of 100 years, there's lots of reasons for optimism if we're willing to look deeply enough. And so that's what I share in my book, Reasons for Optimism.
That was my next question. The future is better than you think. When was it published, and what was your specific, or maybe more than one, inspiration behind writing the book? And just a little bit more about it.
Yeah, so it was published, matter of fact, this year, January of this year. Well, actually, February 1st was the actual publishing release date. But once again, the intention of the book is to help people recognize, as mentioned, that the future is brighter than you think. And it begins with the very first chapter, which is called Being Human. And in that chapter, I talk about, some of the deeper questions that a lot of people aren't willing to ask themselves, like, who am I and why am I here? And when a human being gets to that point where they ask themselves those deeper questions, then we should take 100% responsibility for our lives turning out the way we want them to, because we have that power, I believe. And so my whole intention is to promote optimism and hope, because I'm an optimist. That's the lens through which I see the world. And as mentioned, I recognize the challenges, but as a 60s kid, I remember segregation. I remember separate bathrooms. I remember all the racial stuff that we had in this country. And I remember my grandfather one time where I came home because I was really upset. And I asked my grandfather, I said, Grandpa, why is God so mad at Black people? And he said, what do you mean? And I said, look at all the stuff that we have to go through. So, my grandparents were very religious people, and they're always talking about God. And as a kid, I couldn't wrap my head around, why was God punishing us as Black folk? And my grandfather said something that really stuck with me. He picked me up and sat me on his lap. And he said, God isn't angry at Black people. He said, you must understand this. God has a plan, and his plan is absolutely perfect. And if he chose to make you Black, there's a reason for it. He said, so look at it this way. God is the dealer, and he dealt you a hand. The hand that he dealt you is perfect. You just have to learn how to play your hand. He says, so don't ever think that God is angry or upset. He says, know that God's plan is perfect. And when you align yourself with the plan that he has for your life, everything will take care of itself. Everything will work out. So I was probably 10 years old when he told me that, but I'll never forget that lesson. And there was something in me after listening to him tell me that. Something in me told me that, number one, don't be ashamed to be Black. But more importantly, I felt that being Black was an advantage. I didn't see being Black as a disadvantage. Something in me sort of kind of lit up, well, God made me Black for a reason, and I got a purpose. And man, I really picked up on that idea. And so all of my life, I've never felt that being Black was a disadvantage. The amazing thing about that, though, is that most of my life, I've been accused by Black people, some, of, in my first book, the very first chapter was called the "That's What White People Do" mentality. And I talked about how, because of some of the choices I made, for example, I was born in Corpus Christi, Texas, and I used to love to surf, right? So how many Black kids did you see surfing back, back in the 70s? I used to listen to hard rock music, and my friends would always tease me and call me names. But I've always had this trust in myself that I did what felt right for me, as based on what my grandfather taught me. And so that's, I guess, where my optimism comes from. It was that lesson from my grandfather that, God dealt me this hand, and it was a good hand. And the most powerful lesson that I learned as a kid was one my mom taught me, was if you want something badly enough, no one can keep you from attaining it except yourself. My mother instilled that in me in a very early age. And like I said, we were basically the poster children for poverty back in the 60s, you know, single moms, 6 kids, government housing, government assistance, all of that. But she drilled that in me. If I wanted something badly enough, no one could keep me from attaining it except myself.
It's amazing. As you were talking, as far as being a Black surfer, listening to hard rock, I find it's pretty arrogant to say there's a way to be Black and there's a way not to be Black, because when you really, because and as far as arrogance, you're only looking at yourself. And we forget in 1940, Black people weren't listening to hip hop, and they weren't sagging their pants, and they weren't talking with Ebonics. So are we saying they weren't Black? You know, if you go to China, Black people are not doing, and Black Americans think that the Black America culture is the only Black that exists, and you can't be anything else but that. And it's like, no, there's nothing in the Bible that tells us this is the way to be Black. There's nothing in the law books. So I don't still understand how Americans can be so arrogant to think this is the way to be white, this is how to be Hispanic, this is how to be Asian, instead of realizing that, well, our fingerprints aren't Asian or Hispanic or whatever. So why are we forcing people because of their skin color or ethnicity to be a certain way? And I hope Black people realize you can't take someone's Black card away from them, because there are none to begin with. And so I find it that this is basically, in my humble opinion, the problem with Black people is they don't see diversity amongst themselves, but they're asking everyone else for diversity but themselves, but they themselves don't even have it. And so,
yeah. As a matter of fact, a couple of books back, I wrote a book called Shattering Black Male Stereotypes. And in that book, I basically dispel what I call the 10 most destructive media generated illusions about Black men. And it's a really powerful book. A couple of colleges actually use it as part of their coursework for African American studies. But it's really about bringing awareness to. Now, in my latest book, when it comes to race, I actually have a whole chapter on race. And in the book, I talk about, there's this guy named Ken Wilber, who is a Western philosopher, amazing guy. And he said, there are 3 primary worldviews that human beings see through. He said there's an ethnocentric worldview, which basically means that human beings are separate and different because of ethnicity. He said there's a human-centric worldview, which means that we accept that we as human beings are the same. And then there's the cosmocentric worldview, which means everything is connected to everything else, okay? And I love that worldview. That's the worldview through which I see the world. The overwhelming majority of human beings are trapped in that ethnocentric worldview. And so when you look at like white supremacists, they take that worldview literally, thinking that their ethnicity is somehow superior to other people. So that's just an ethnocentric worldview magnified, amplified to the negative. And it happens a lot, obviously. So what we as human beings have to do is to shift our worldviews. Now, if you get involved in what I'll call the personal development genre, which I'm in, it's really about, we talked about mindset. It's about changing your mind, because we have to be willing to shift our mindset away from that ethnocentric, we're different and separate because of ethnicity, and at least move to the human-centric worldview, saying that we're all the same as human beings. That can be really difficult to do, especially as Black people, when we're so inundated with so much negativity and so forth. But, and as you mentioned, even within our own group, we struggle. So the point of the book is to open your mind to really, you familiar with the movie The Matrix?
yes.
Okay, you remember the red pill, blue pill?
You know, I saw it, I guess, at an age where I can't really say I remember much of it.
Okay, well, in the movie, and it's a powerful scene because it's really about choice. The guy says, you have a red pill, you have a blue pill. If you take the blue pill, you go back to sleep and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill and you get to see what's really going on, and you get to go see how far down the rabbit hole goes. And it's really a metaphor for us choosing how we see the world. So we always have a choice. You can take the red pill or the blue pill. The red pill is about truth, but truth is painful sometimes. Truth is difficult sometimes. That's why most people won't take the red pill. Most people would rather take the blue pill. And so my books are really about taking the red pill. It's really about challenging you to look at your beliefs and assumptions that you have about yourself and the world around you. And that's the whole intention of my work.
So you can say all of your books, in a sense, one of the things I say as humans, especially Americans, a lot of Americans are still baby birds. When birds are first born, their eyes are shut and they just have to trust whatever their parents feed them. But at a certain age, they're not only their eyes open, they're shown what they're eating, their parents show them how to get it for themselves. And unfortunately, in America, most people stay baby birds. They never open their eyes to see what information they're being received, whether school, college, church, whatever. And they just stay, their eyes are always closed. They're always opening their mouth, expecting someone to educate them, feed them, give them something. And they never take the chance to open their eyes and say, it's time for me to get it myself. So would you say your books help assist people to finally open up their eyes to see more than just, basically open up their eyes?
That's the whole intention of the book. Now, my primary focus, and this is the big elephant in the room when it comes to the world. It is my belief that the greatest challenge we have on the planet right now is to redefine masculinity, to redefine what it means to be a man. Because if you'll look at, for centuries, we talk about patriarchy and the patriarchal system. Men have always been conditioned to believe that we have three primary responsibilities, what I call the 3 Ps: procreate, provide, and protect. Those have been the roles that men have been following since the beginning of time. Unfortunately, as men, we were never taught how to connect. So why is it so difficult for us as men to connect? Because of our culture. Our culture says that men are warriors and fighters. We're always fighting and defending and all of that. But what men long for, I believe, and are really hungry for, is connection. And yet most of us don't know how to attain connection. Why? Because of our current male culture. Now, I wrote a book called A New Conversation with Men, which is also the name of my radio show. And in the book, I talk about what I call the 5 illusions of manhood, okay? The very first illusion is that to be a man, you must be non-emotional and disconnected. See, that's the first illusion. And so our society and culture has taught us as men that it's not okay to feel, that feelings are for women, right? So as men, we shut down, suppress, repress how we feel. And we process everything from the neck up. And then we wonder why our relationships don't work out. Well, our relationships can't work out because you can't be relational if you're unwilling to be emotional. And so too many times as men, we aren't emotional because our culture has conditioned us not to be. So that's another conversation that I have, which is designed to open people's eyes, especially men, to let them know that we have to shift the paradigm. And I define paradigm as a rigid way of believing, thinking, and behaving. So when we shift the rigid ways of believing, thinking, and behaving, we shift the paradigm and then we shift the culture. So what I've been writing about for the past 25 years is really about changing the masculine paradigm, challenging men to recognize that there's a different way to see the world. There's a different way to act in the world. And the majority of my books are targeted specifically to and about men.
It's great. I definitely agree with that. I think it's mostly because not only were we not taught to connect, we were taught to compete with one another. And I know at some point in my life, I started being more around females, and it was fun because we just had conversations. And then when I would get with boys, males, it would always be an argument of who's better at something. And for me, if I'm not good at something, I have no shame in saying I'm not good at it. And I kind of stopped being around men because I never wanted to compete with them. I'd rather talk about, one of the favorite things I like to discuss around people are my nephews and nieces. And I don't want to talk about that I'm better, I can run faster, I can, play this sport, because I'm not athletic in any way, shape, or form. But we're not taught in conversations to connect. We're really taught to compete. And you're considered a girl if you're not, competing against something. And so I truly believe, and I'm trying to figure, I guess, I don't know, ancient days it started. I don't know how it started and how long it's been since this has been, but I hope we do realize that connection is better and more important than competing.
It's interesting that you say that, because that's the fifth illusion of manhood. I said there's 5 illusions. The fifth illusion is that to be a man, you must constantly compete with and try to outdo other men. You see, that's how deeply ingrained that is into masculine culture. We're always competing against each other, trying to one-up each other. And that's the fifth illusion, as a matter of fact.
Wow. So I know you just newly published this book, but are you, because you have so many, are you working on another project for 2022, 2023, or are you just keeping focused on this one book?
Well, I love writing, absolutely love writing. As a matter of fact, I've written a book a year for the last 6 years, a brand new book, which people say that's crazy, but it's just something that I'm really passionate about. I'm currently working on 3 other projects because it's just something that I absolutely love doing. I am going to try to, I'm not going to, like I always write my new books in September. I have a structure, so I always write in September. But this year, obviously, I'm going to put a lot of focus on this new book, because I think now more than ever, the world is hungry for optimism. I think right now the world needs optimism. The world needs a sense of hope. I'm in the process of finishing up Barack Obama's book, A Promised Land. And it's inspired me to do what I can to help America fulfill its promise, because I believe that promise can be fulfilled. It's not there yet, but I think it can be. And it's my responsibility to do what I can to try to help America fulfill its promise of being what I think it's possible of becoming. And so writing is the tool through which I do that, through which I try to support and empower and impact people's lives to help America fulfill the promise. Because as mentioned, I am an optimist. I absolutely love this country. I recognize all the challenges within it, but I have a sense of responsibility that my job is to do something to make it better. And that's why I write, that's why I speak, and that's why I share optimism.
Great. So my last question for you today, fun question, somewhat off the topic. If there was an author out there who inspired you and you had the chance to co-author a book with them, and this author could be either dead or alive, known or unknown, who would it be and why?
Dr. Wayne Dyer. Unfortunately, Dr. Dyer passed away a couple of years ago. But when I was in my 20s, I started reading Wayne Dyer. And he wrote a book called Your Erroneous Zones. And at the time, I was basically an atheist. And I really liked his work because during that time, he didn't talk about God or spirituality. He talked about the mind. He basically used science and psychology to explain things. And in that book, he said something that was so impactful for me. He said, as a human being, you have within you the capacity to do anything any other human being has ever done. And if it hasn't been done, you can be the first. Now, I'm 20 something years old. I'm climbing the corporate ladder for this company that I was working for. As a matter of fact, I became the youngest manager in the history of this particular company, and only the second Black manager in 87 years that the company had been in business. But it was Dr. Dyer's teachings that, number one, inspired me to climb the corporate ladder and do things that most people said that a young Black male with only an 11th grade education could accomplish. But after I went through my divorce and bankruptcy and all of that, I continued reading his stuff, and his writings kind of started evolving with my thinking because he started adding more spiritual context to his books. And it was, to me, pretty amazing that it's like we were evolving at the same time, or maybe it was just my perception. But as his books got deeper spiritually, so did my spirituality. And I had an opportunity to meet him, to embrace him, to talk to him. Just an amazing human being that is the second most impactful person in my life. So that's the guy that I'd love to sit down and collaborate with, because he is, second to my mom, most responsible for how I think.
Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this episode of The Ready Writer. I want to thank my audience, as always, for joining me, and our guest, Michael Taylor. Thank you so much. Have yourself a great day.